Good afternoon, C3EB attendees. Welcome to this presentation on day 2 of the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit. Our overall theme today has been sort of government, governance, civic engagement, institutions, various types of institutions around us, and the role that all of these play in creating or advancing equity and inclusion and creating a more engaged and informed citizenry. With that in mind, this is going to be this current presentation that you're about to watch, whether you're watching this live or later, is going to be a very, very timely presentation given what is happening in the country around us right now with various sports teams. But before I introduce our speaker and give him the stage to blow us all away, I do have a couple of our usual housekeeping notes for you. One, hope you're joining us on YouTube Live or Facebook, our Facebook page. You can comment and interact with us directly. We get those comments real time, so we are able to respond to you. Please go ahead and subscribe. Go to our Facebook page, like, and send us your feedback, ratings, whatever you want, recommendations, so that we can use your feedback to continue to improve our services to you. Secondly, this summit would not be possible, and future summits would not be possible without our partners and sponsors walking the walk with us toward equity, belongingness, and intentional inclusion. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you to my partners and sponsors for this summit: Essential IT, our web team; Defy the Status Quo Marketing; Zanzibar Enterprises; and the Nielsen Company. So with that being said, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce the C3, to all of you, and to bring to the C3EB platform our current expert speaker, Newlyn Wing. Hi, Newlyn.
Hey, Dr. AJ. Great to be with you.
Great to have you here. So I just want to read your bio before I jump off stage. For those of you who don't know Newlyn Wing, Newlyn is a leader within the national and Orlando Asian American communities, holding roles as the president of the National Association of Asian American Professionals Orlando chapter and the chief strategy officer role with NAP National. Having over 5 years of nonprofit and national governing body experience, Newlyn is passionate about strategies and partnerships that drive social impact. He most recently worked in the U.S. Tennis Association, where he oversaw a national collegiate club sports program that gave non-varsity athletes opportunities to compete while encouraging them to be involved with growing tennis in their communities. From voter education to co-hosting and moderating judicial candidate forums, he believes civic engagement, involvement, and education is imperative. Ooh, so timely, so timely. And I love your bio. But I can gush about you all day long because you're one of my favorite people ever. But this is your presentation and your stage, so I'm handing it off to you. Thank you so much again, and welcome.
Thank you, AJ. Certainly high praise coming from you, and I want to just say thank you to you, as well as the organizers and sponsors, like you mentioned, as well as anyone tuning in. Anyone who's tuning into this, I believe, is certainly a leader in their area, and DEI is such an important thing right now. And as AJ mentioned, there's so much movement in this space, especially in the sports realm. And actually, I had to change this presentation quite a bit this morning, just given what's going on this week. And actually, if I could have my slides here, I'm going to start presenting my slides. There we go. Thank you. And really, again, I want to welcome all of you. So appreciate you spending time with us and spending time with me this afternoon. And whether you're watching live or watching the recording, hopefully you will get a lot out of this. There's really 3 main things that I wanted to cover with you this afternoon. And really, what they do, or what we will look at today, is looking at sports' role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. When a lot of people think of DEI, they don't necessarily think of sports. And sports actually has been a driving force for DEI even before the term DEI was widely used. So we're really going to look at how sports and sporting organizations play a role in that, how they historically have, as well as how they do it right now. And then we're going to use some case examples and some case studies to show what those relationships can look like in advancing equity and inclusion, and what those partnerships can look like from a tangible level. So we'll certainly start pretty high level in the pro sports area, get down into some specific sports organization examples, and then get into how communities and organizations can really leverage sports to drive DEI and to really make an impact in that area. And how we're going to break up this conversation is by answering three main questions. So the first one is, how have sports culturally played a part in DEI? So we'll look at some history and some different icons in our culture in the United States that have played a part in that. Then we'll look at what role do they play in advancing DEI. So moving past the individual figures and organizations, we'll get into specific professional sports associations and different organizations and how we can work with them. And then again, at the very end, what does that look like and how can partnerships leverage sport? We'll use some very specific local examples of what that looks like and how this is a very replicable process that you can use in your local area as well. And in this last slide, you can kind of see how pro sports organizations and communities and organizations are kind of separate here. There's kind of a hierarchy. But what we're really going to encourage us to look at today is more of a Venn diagram kind of layout. So again, often sports and DEI aren't necessarily grouped together, but and there's certainly a belief in some circles that DEI and has no place, and sports have no place in the conversation with DEI. But I will make the case today and show some results that show that not as only sports hold a place in that, it's a pivotal piece of advancing DEI. And whether you're a sports person or not, whether you're a huge lifelong sports fan or you really just don't care, you're not a big sports person, we certainly have a place for you in this presentation. And whether you're an organizer or just curious how sports have played a part in the advancement of DEI, there's going to be something for you here today. So very excited to be with all of you. So again, let's look at it from a historical perspective first of what DEI and sports have in common. And this is more of a rhetorical question for all of us, but there's certainly times when sporting moments have had huge cultural impact. And if you can kind of get in that mindset of maybe one or two that you can think of in your lifetime, you can either share those in the chat or if you just hold those in mind if you're watching, not during the live piece. And we're going to look at some trailblazers in culture. So looking at a timeline of significant cultural events that have revolved around sports, and what that impact has been on DEI. And the first one I'm going to use is, of course, Jackie Robinson. So Jackie Robinson was the first African-American player to break the color line with baseball, and that happened on April 15th, 1947. So 73 years ago, and again, we're going to establish a bit of a timeline here that I'll explain the significance of later. But Jackie Robinson was really the first person in this group to do this. And one thing to keep in mind is that Jackie Robinson and our next figure, who I'll mention momentarily here, did this before the Civil Rights era. So the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1963 happened obviously 16 years after Jackie Robinson. So sports really has been a driving force in these conversations and in civil rights. And that can also be seen through Althea Gibson, who was the first African-American women tennis player to break the color line and to play on the professional tennis tour, which before her time was pretty much all white and affluent players. And so that was about 70 years ago and 13 years before the Civil Rights Act. And then not necessarily someone who broke a color line or who was as involved with civil rights per se, but Michael Jordan, the establishment of the Jordan line, his agreement with Nike, and just the extreme cultural impact that the Bulls had and Michael Jordan had on the United States was massive. And if anyone's watched The Last Dance or any other documentary for that matter about Michael Jordan, you can see how much incredible cultural pull that Michael Jordan had. And this one is not necessarily a civil rights affiliated incident, but the Boston Marathon bombing was just another example. And this one's a little bit more recent, just seeing about 7 years ago, where a sports incident really helped the country rally around something. And there was just an outpouring of support for not just Boston, but for all those affected and just what was going on there. And so again, just showing that sports, whether it's in civil rights or not, or DEI or not, certainly is a conduit to galvanize around certain causes. And just this year for tennis, and I did work for the U.S. Tennis Association, so there'll be plenty of tennis references in this presentation. But just this year, and I pulled this information last week, so it might even be different, but looking at the U.S. Open Grand Slam in New York, you can see there's a list here of just, and these are just American players, but women of color who are on the main draw list for the U.S. Open. So again, going from Althea Gibson, which was about 70 years ago, being the only African-American or person of color to compete on the tennis tour, to now much more involvement, much more inclusion. We've certainly come a long way with that. And while we've come a long way, I just want to show kind of a timeline here, because while a lot of times we look at this and think, 1950 or 1963, that was such a long time ago, and we've come a long way. We certainly made strides, and I don't want to override that or to not put value on the sacrifices and the efforts that have gotten us to where we are. But I do want to kind of point out it really hasn't been that long, and even especially once you get towards the more current part of our timeline here, there's a lot more going on in the sports arena, and there's a lot more advocacy as well as acknowledgement of certain movements that are going on. And one thing I also want to just acknowledge here when it comes to looking at people like Jackie Robinson and Althea Gibson is that during their time, they really didn't have the backing and the associations, and there was no social media, obviously. So it was much more difficult to get a cause going and to get these kind of rights for themselves. So Althea Gibson did not have an association backing her, at least in the early stages, and Jackie Robinson, largely these people had to do it not completely on their own, but they were much more alone in this. And so we're seeing a very drastic change, I would say, in a positive way, that we're seeing more advocacy from a sports realm and more holistic as well. So just as an example, about 6 years ago with the Eric Garner killing, the LA Lakers wearing I Can't Breathe shirts during the warm-up was one example, and many teams participating in something similar. But you also have, as of more recently, and even as last night and this week with the NBA playoffs, you have acknowledgement over the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as teams striking and protesting by simply not playing. And so this is certainly a big thing that we've gone from more individual contributions and leading up to the Civil Rights Act to now more association-wide and organization-wide efforts to support DEI, civil rights, and really these gaps that we see in our culture and in our economy. So again, this timeline is kind of to show that while we have made progress, we certainly have a long way to go. And just recent events and current events show that pretty much week over week, unfortunately. But the good news is that there is much more of a galvanizing around these kinds of movements, and also there's more resources, which we'll talk about that in a little bit here. And I'll admit I'm a Detroit Lions fan, so I was selective with a couple of headlines here. But again, you can kind of see, and I just pulled these this morning actually, you can see that there's a lot more movement around this, and there's more organizational movement. So whereas before Colin Kaepernick or some of these individuals might have acted individually, now you have entire teams, you have entire organizations such as the Detroit Lions who are doing different things and showing alignment with different causes more en masse, as opposed to one-offs and things of that nature. So kind of bridging the gap here again, we started with the professional sports realm, and now we're going to dive more into some specific organizations that might be present in our communities and really looking at their role in sports, as well as the sports role in DEI. Again, that's not a connection that's always made. So I'd love to kind of draw some parallels here and look into like what that actually looks like, as well as different organizations. And again, we'll look at a little bit closer level. We'll look at more regional things as well as local, and answer the question of what role do sports organizations have in advancing DEI? And with my background at having worked for the U.S. Tennis Association and exposure at that level, we're going to start with national governing bodies, partly because of my experience, but also because these are generally your most visual and most well-known organizations when it comes to this area. And certainly NGBs have a vested interest in the communities they are located in. So USGA or the NBA or MLS, whatever city they happen to be in, they certainly have interest and they have efforts that they use to build community in those areas. But two particular areas I'd like to point to when it comes to these kind of organizations is first the foundations, and then we'll talk about employee and business resource groups. But the foundations often offer scholarships, grants, internships, and other resources for grassroots and other programs. And this is a great relationship and a great connection between DEI and the sports world are these foundations. And just some that just from doing a quick search this week that you can look into and that you can look as examples of the NBA Foundation, USDA Foundation, MLS Works, the Youth Development Foundation through baseball and the MLB, and some other ones that aren't as associated with national governing bodies like the Women's Sports Foundation. And I want to draw some specific point outs to the NBA Foundation, and because they specifically call out in their mission of working with DEI, working on providing anti-racist things and helping the African American community. And so, and in my experience with the USGA Foundation, they offer scholarships, they have programs and grants for grassroots level. And so, quite frankly, I'm not as familiar with some of these other foundations, but just from doing a search here in the Central Florida area where I am and in the Detroit area where I believe many of our viewers are, there's a ton of foundations. And so I would just highly recommend looking into these, doing some research into these, because again, these serve in many ways as the bridge between community efforts and some of these national sports organizations and what they do. And in addition to their foundation, many of these national governing body groups and kind of blending some lines here, but also corporations have what they call employee resource groups or business resource groups that represent DEI efforts. And many of these groups will have different affinity groups, whether it's African American, Asian American, LGBTQ. There are a lot of them that focus solely on being an employee resource group, which is more about engagement and development of their internal employees. And then some are more, for example, when I was with the USDA, I was a co-chair of our Asian American BRG, and they intersected more as to drive business goals, as well as to have that representation for different employees and different demographics. And one of the reasons I bring these up is because this serves as a great partnership opportunity for DEI. And again, many of these foundations, many of these organizations have internships, they have opportunities, they have grants and resources available for things. And some actually also do them through their ERGs or BRGs. So I wanted to call attention to this because while we might not think that DEI and sports have a lot of overlap, foundations certainly are kind of the charitable arm of many of these organizations to get into these communities and to really help advance DEI goals as well. Another group that we want to look at here in terms of looking at more local organizations that we can work with and that have a huge aspect of DEI behind them are community organizations. So many people, when they think of community organizations, this is the YMCAs, the Parks and Recs, there might be sports clubs or academies in your area. And when we think of these, we might really wonder, well, what does that have to do with DEI, and what does that have to do with this area that we're talking about? And a massive part of it has to do with youth sports. When it comes to youth sports, and unfortunately, a lot of times there's not as much conversation with DEI, with youth sports, and with these organizations, because again, we're not making those connections at this point a lot of times. But really what we're looking at, if you look at research, and on the screen here, you can see some research from the National Center for Biotechnology Information. There's pretty significant disparities in health between or for minorities. And this particular study looked at the availability of recreation programs as one of the big hurdles that many of these communities look at and many of these communities have to deal with. and how that can lead to higher rates of obesity and health issues by not having access to certain programs and certain things. And one thing that they had mentioned was simply the an access to a playground, and having the resources and putting resources into these communities to enable them to have access to sports leagues, to even something as simple as equipment and organized sports is a pretty big driving force in terms of reducing obesity, for example. And so this is just one example of many where there's certainly health implications when it comes to DEI, and we're covering a lot of different ground here. But when we start looking at the bigger picture of what sports can do for DEI and for equity in particular, when it comes to certain communities, sports is a massive piece. So putting in resources to support these and putting in, again, support to get more of these programs going and make sure that there's access and universal access to these programs is a major piece. And this quote is something from a White House study that was done a few years ago. And really, when it comes to many of these sports organizations as well, when you think about almost a coalition, if you're able to build one up, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here, think about foundations, government, youth organizations, and sports organizations, and national governing bodies, really start piling up some good resources to start supporting these communities more, get more programs in their communities, and to really start combating some of these health issues. And as identified through the study here, it's not always a massive investment. When you look at some of these sports leagues that need to be set up, it's a pretty minor cost to getting some of these going. And as they identified as well, with volunteer networks and national governing bodies and associations, building those relationships really can enhance outcomes both for these communities and for their children, and when it comes to health benefits, as well as long-term sustainable impact when it comes to these programs. And lastly here, looking at how we can work within sports to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, we're going to kind of finish some of our thoughts here with just what does this actually look like? Because we've talked a lot about DEI and sports organizations. So we've kind of laid out all the pieces here, as well as looked at some historical context to how sports have driven DEI. But what does this actually look like, and what are some examples of what we can do? And we're going to look at some examples from my personal experience of how we've been able to bridge communities, foundations, and national governing bodies around not just business goals, but community goals and more altruistic goals to really drive DEI, as well as just community benefit in general. And before we get into that, I do want to share, this is a great resource from the Sport Management Review about DEI efforts. And essentially what they did was they looked at DEI practices, and are these really being incorporated into sports organizations, and not just national governing bodies, but more so like your regular sports clubs and different athletic clubs and things like that. And they came up with six common responses responses, but also pushbacks to DEI efforts being included in. So before we get into some specifics in terms of what I've seen work very well with partnerships and coalitions, I just want to share this as a resource for you guys and go through the 6 areas very briefly that they had talked about. And the paper was titled, "We Want More Diversity, But..." So there's 6 areas that they really look at. So the first one was speech acts. And so diversity might be included in their mission statement of things that, like, everyone is welcome and we believe in diversity and inclusion and we practice it, but there's not really any action taken to ensure that. And as many of us know, this could also pertain to organizations and companies as well. If that's included in a mission statement, but there's no specific strategy or programs around it, then it's going to be very difficult to really see the fruit of that. And the second one, moral boundary work, aka bias boundaries. So we see this a lot in sports when it comes to coaching in particular. The NFL, thankfully, has made some progress in this, where we're starting to see women coaches and different people who traditionally wouldn't hold certain roles be able to break those barriers and get into those roles. But it's certainly a challenge that we see with grassroots level of being very, again, for lack of a better word, traditional around who holds what roles and what weaknesses are perceived, as opposed to people's actual value and what they're actually good at. That's how it's done here, or in-group essentialism is what this paper called it. And again, this kind of ties into our last one, but using "we've always done it this way" and the status quo as a reason to keep practicing exclusive practices. So with that, traditionally, here's the way we've done it. They haven't really looked outside the mold of what they've done, and that defensiveness really is the only reason they're going in this direction. That's certainly something that when we're trying to incorporate DEI practices into sports organizations, we certainly see this quite a bit as well. Denying privilege and denial of silencing, marginalizing differences and discrimination, masking racism in different areas, inappropriately joking about topics. This is certainly something that also ties into whistleblower things. So creating cultures where these kind of conversations can't be brought up, or they're taboo to bring up. That's certainly something we see where, again, when the organizational culture is such that these things just aren't talked about, that's certainly a red flag of having DEI and other inclusive practices. And our last two here, self-victimization or self-pity. A lot of times with some of these groups, you might see, or they might view DEI efforts as barriers for them. So they don't necessarily the business case for it. They don't see it as a business tool. They see it as something they have to overcome. It's like, well, now we have to do so much more extra work, and it doesn't fit into what we do anymore to be inclusive and to do this. And certainly this is a short-term and short vision perception of things, because as it's been proved before, being more inclusive, being more diverse, not only brings in diversity of thought, but also grows your business and is much more economical for an organization as well. And I believe our last one here, bodily inscription or dehumanizing worth. Unfortunately, we see this a lot with athletes who are people of color, that as opposed to their intelligence or just the fact that they're valuable as a human being, their skills, their strength, their athleticism gets mentioned. And whereas if it was a non-person of color being described, then they might talk about their intelligence, or they might talk about something else. But we see this as inclusion being dependent on those things. So as opposed to just having an inclusive environment where anyone can participate, and there's again, the value is placed on a human being, it's placed on their individual skills or strengths, which we certainly don't want to see if we're looking for a equitable and inclusive environment. So again, the reason we bring these up is not necessarily to solve them in today's session, but more so looking at just as you're thinking about DEI in sports, it's just, according to the study, these are 6 of the main areas that really came up quite a bit when they were trying to incorporate these into approaches. So more of a tool for you if you're watching this that you can certainly look at and be ready for as part of this effort. But moving forward, let's look into how we really form coalitions, and overlapping goals can certainly be a huge piece of what we're doing with DEI, and how we can use that within sports to advance DEI. And so again, with my experience from a national governing body perspective, we're going to tie that in with community organizations and see how that works. And I'll say that partnerships are a huge part of this. So intersecting goals is a great first step, and that's how we're going to answer what this looks like when it comes to partnerships between sport organizations in the DEI realm. And so to lay the foundation before we get into the specifics, thinking about all the information we've gone through so far, we've talked about, again, the historical context, we've talked about the how sports have played a role in the DEI realm, and we talked about different organizations that might exist in your community. So taking all the information and thinking about a coalition approach to this, there's ways that we can bring these groups together. And while it's certainly altruistic and DEI is really imperative of us having a equitable society, there's certain ways that we can also accomplish business goals and have a win-win situation with partnerships. And you can see on your screen here just 4 a bit oversimplified, but also just kind of setting the parameters of 4 main areas of seeing what's in your area based on the organizations that we've shared earlier, establishing contact with them and seeing what DEI efforts they might already have, and then building mutual beneficial goals so that we're all aligned within one thing and executing against those goals, again, as a very simple starting process for this. And the example I'll use today as kind of our case study is looking at the U.S. Tennis Association, NAP, which is the National Association of Asian American Professionals, and some of the employee resource groups that were at USTA, and how we really intersected some of those goals to drive some change. And what you can see on your screen here, I'm not going to read every line, but you can see different roles or different pieces that each area was, or each organization was able to contribute. So the employee resource group, we really were able to use, they wanted professional development, they wanted exposure, and to really push DEI as something important to the organization and to celebrate the diversity within our employee resource groups. So really for them, exposure for programs and services to diverse demographics was a big one. And then for the USTA, whose mission is to grow and develop grow and promote the game of tennis, promoting their own DEI efforts, foundation scholarships, D&I internships, et cetera, and just showing that they value DEI was a huge piece. And then with NAP, we were able to bring in our community connections and share those opportunities with these 2 other groups, and certainly partner with USTA of certain tennis events and using resources that they had available to host events and bring value to the community while executing on some of the goals that the USTA staff had. And so once the initial relationship was formed, we were able to put on really 4 main areas here, and these are just kind of scratching the surface on what we were able to do. But self-care and wellness, this certainly was the reason this ties into our DEI stuff, is because we were able to partner with NAP, or the USTA was able to partner with NAP to bring in a self-care and wellness program that was specific to Asian Americans. And so we were able to bring that program in, do a few sessions with our employees, and really bring a diverse need to employees to fulfill that. And then in addition to that, we were able to host a symposium at the USTA National Campus, along with our National Leadership Academy. So some very tangible, kind of more in the weed examples of this fruit of that partnership. And then tennis mixers with community partners. That was an example of, again, accomplishing some business goals with the USTA while bringing value to a diverse community and being able to bring people together and celebrate our culture, as well as play some great tennis. So again, some tangible examples of how ERGs and national governing bodies have been able to use sport to really unite, communicate our communities, and accomplish a few different things together. And as we're kind of talking about this too, it does go past simply working at events and promoting employee well-being. While that was certainly a great benefit we had from doing this, advancing DEI and having just having these partnerships, there's so much we can do in the future as well. So again, I'd mentioned many organizations will have scholarships, they'll have internships, resources for community building and for grassroots efforts. And just through this connection that these groups were able to create, they now have access to each other, and they're much more strong together. And the more nonprofit association group has access to resources from the national governing body and their foundation. And so just that in itself, and this is, I believe, a template that you can use across different organizations. So while it was the Asian American Professional Group here in Orlando that was able to do this, it could be for any group, regardless of mission or regardless of ethnicity or background. So again, more of a template as we're kind of looking at this Rubik's Cube of how we get these pieces to work together. So with all of that, what I'd like to just pose to anyone watching this is what could you do in your community? So again, to go back to our objectives, we looked at 3 main areas of how sports has played a role in the past of advancing DEI efforts and civil rights efforts. And then we looked at specific programs, specific organizations that we can partner with and that we can have in our communities that will help with this. And then third, we we looked at some specific examples of the fruits that those partnerships can bring. And so I'd really encourage you to think about those programs, those partnerships, and you can incorporate sport into DEI education in other areas, because there's certainly quite a bit of resources out there. And to go back to something that Dr. AJ said in the introduction, there's more than ever. This is more top of mind than ever. And so certainly there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of exposure when it comes to sports and DEI and civil rights. And so I think there's a great opportunity now to really leverage that and to advance your goals together in an area that, quite frankly, from what I've seen, often doesn't really get included in the DEI conversation is sports. So I think leveraging and using sports as a unifying theme is certainly something that we can do to advance DEI. And so at this point, I'll kind of pause here and see if we have any Q&A and discussion. But as I'm waiting for Dr. AJ to come back, or any of the other admins, again, I'll kind of just go back to our beginning slides here. And put these 3 questions up, because I think it's certainly worth looking at these and what we can do here.
Hi, Newlyn.
Hey, Ruthie.
That was, I have to say, even being, I feel pretty plugged into DE&I, I haven't, actively considered how sports might play a role, but I guess that's really important from everything to, everything from college on up, especially when you consider the representation in a lot of the most popular sports in America. But I think what's probably interesting is now we're seeing more teams start to position themselves to having a DE&I voice. And so we've had sports teams, right, walk out or kind of boycott games now at this point. And so I'm wondering what you think about, or what you would recommend, I guess, for sports teams who have to consider balancing their bottom line with being a platform megaphone for, equity and inclusion.
Sure, certainly. And I think when you look at, there's kind of 2 parts to this. And like you mentioned, just like any other organization, they do have to think about their bottom line. And, if they cancel an entire season due to something like this, then certainly that's going to have impact, right?
Right.
But I think just looking at overall, like we've shared today, how impactful sports are in this area and in our culture, I think we have to kind of step back and look at the magnitude of it. And I would hope that's something that these sports groups can do, is look at their impact and how impactful they are and how much of a role they play in this, in addition to the dollars and cents. And I think giving those kind of opportunities and really focusing on that opens up so many opportunities for them as well, where you're going to get much more buy-in and much more support from these communities. And especially as the United States starts heading towards a minority majority country, there's certainly a business imperative to it as well. So I think it's a great question. It's a very difficult one, but not thinking too much about the short term and just the long term of the implications of this are certainly what I'd recommend for them.
That is spot on. That is spot on, I think. And, I think we actually would have seen additional ripples within the sporting community if a lot of their seasons hadn't been canceled or put on hold due to COVID. I think, it's just a time where a lot more people are feeling like, yes, they're in, entertainment. They're an actor, actress, singer, sports player. And so, when I was growing up, it was always, play ball, don't play politics, or keep singing, don't do politics, or whatever. And I think a lot more people are starting to put that aside in the effort to use their positions for good. So you mentioned like local, community organizations and larger organizations kind of building these partnerships. So how do the smaller, the local youth sports organizations, help, and how do they contribute to these coalitions that are being built, that you're talking about here for the underrepresented groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, Ruthie, I think some of the smaller organizations that are more grassroots play even a bigger part of this than I might have even mentioned during the presentation, because again, many of them aren't always thinking about DEI. They're just running, and exactly like you said, the thought about sports being kind of in a silo and not playing a part in DEI and in how big culturally it is something that you can certainly see at the pro level, like you mentioned, and I think of the whole like shut up and dribble kind of train of thought. But then that also goes to the local level where they might think, well, we're not a DEI group, we're a sports group, and again, with them, there's certainly the more altruistic, well, this is something we should be doing thought, but just in terms of just dollars and cents, I mean, the wider net you cast and the more communities you touch, the more able you are to bring in larger groups, as well as have some of that corporate responsibility kind of feel to your organization, where you might be able to get grants or get sponsorship from other organizations. So while it might seem like a lot of upfront work and just going down a rabbit hole, there are long-term implications and long-term benefits to having these kind of DEI practices, even for small grassroots programs.
Well said. Thank you so much. That like I said, that was just an interesting intersection of topics there that I don't think many of us have considered. But definitely, I think more partnerships like what you're talking about will give more organizations, more sports players, all of it, to an opportunity to have an outlet, an effective outlet for their activism. Because now people are starting to see it. It's a human issue. It's not a political issue. And how can you be silent about human issues?
Exactly.
Right. So just thank you so much for being here and being a part of this first C3EB Summit. So I want to say thank you first for that.
Pleasure is all mine. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm excited to watch everyone else's today and tomorrow.
Yes, speaking of, we do have several other sessions today, some of them ongoing right now and into this evening. And then, of course, like you said, day 3, where we will be having everything again from 9 to 9 with our closing keynote. So if you are ready to keep the C3EB energy going, then please go ahead and check out some of the other sessions that we have going on. Be sure to connect with Newlyn wherever you find him on social media. And thank you again to all of our sponsors. Your likes, shares, and comments help us keep the summit going. So be sure to do that and help us grow so we continue being a platform for these types of topics and these very educated and concerned voices. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.